Good evening and welcome to Last Week Tonight. I'm Joan Oliver and tonight we'll be discussing a topic that doesn't get enough attention. What are the ethic and moral values considered in the making of a Game of Thrones film? I'm kidding, it's critical race theory. We're talking about critical race theory. Critical race theory is a constantly evolving area of political science that is often clarified through theorists' time period, location, and position in society. Although there are many theorists to choose from, the two highly influential race theorists we'll be focusing on today are James Baldwin and Irene Watson, who offer relevant and important insights into how critical race theory can be seen to be operating in our society today. Although these theorists share similarities in how they recognise the systematic oppression, there are significant differences regarding core themes that separate their arguments. So let's introduce the key thinkers. James Baldwin. Now, if you immediately thought of the Baldwin actors, you maybe need to broaden your social circle. And I mean you, Stacey. Come on, Stacey. Letting the team down. No, Baldwin was a highly prevalent critical race theorist and civil rights movement leader during the 1960s, whose work focused on the systematic oppression of African Americans by the government and wider American society. In one of his more famous pieces, A Letter to My Nephew, Baldwin states that his primary dispute with his country centers on how the white and powerful members of the US dictate the lives and opportunities of African Americans through systematic oppression. Baldwin's work was bold and significant for its time and remains an important touchstone for critical race theory due to its ongoing relevance within the United States. However, Baldwin only explores the experiences of the non-white migrants within the US and does not seem to address the effects of colonialism for people of colour, which leaves us with only a narrow understanding of critical race theory. This is where I'd like to introduce you to Irene Watson. Irene Watson is currently one of Australia's most prevalent Aboriginal political thinkers who specialises in the examination of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships within a global context. Her ideas are at the forefront of critical race theory in Australia as she examines the effect colonialism continues to have on Indigenous peoples. Not only does Watson's work have substance in colonised countries, but her commentary on the treatment of Australian Indigenous people holds significant weight in Australian academia. In her introduction from her 2015 book Aboriginal Peoples, Colonialism and International Law, Raw Law, Watson states that through the denial of valid Indigenous sovereign practices, the colonial project has constructed Indigenous people as being uncivilised, without society, and without law. She argues that these depictions of indigeneity are harmful, dangerous, and constructed to service the colonial narrative that constantly puts colonisers in the powerful position. However, Watson does not touch upon the role of non-white migrants in the colonial narrative. Therefore, through combining the arguments from both Watson and Baldwin, a more rounded understanding of critical race theory can be achieved. Despite not living in the same time period or country, Watson and Baldwin share similar ideas regarding the importance of recognising the racist systems that aim to control the identity of non-white citizens. Both authors have personal experiences with systematic oppression that they claim to have shaped their relationship and view of society. Both note that oppression is systematically taught and normalised through the social systems such as schooling and policy. Additionally, they recognise that there has been a sanitation of history that is further supported by citizens not challenging normalised ways of thinking or questioning their own involvement in systematic oppression. Although these similar themes can be seen through their work, Baldwin and Watson's differences in their ideologies are significant. Firstly, and perhaps the most substantial difference, is that Baldwin's work fails to recognise the influences of colonialism, which is an integral theme in Watson's work. Secondly, Watson does not mention the contribution of non-white migrants, a group that is the focus of Baldwin's work. Finally, it's likely that Watson would find Baldwin's want of recognition by white people highly problematic. So let's get into it. Irene Watson recognises colonisation to be one of the most prevalent and powerful oppressive forces for Indigenous people globally. She spends a significant amount of time unpacking the work that colonisation does to purport a negative narrative about Indigenous peoples to delegitimise Indigenous sovereignty, which she calls raw law. She argues this is particularly prevalent in Australia. Problematically, the effects of colonisation were not mentioned at all in Baldwin's piece, A Letter to My Nephew. Now, some might say this is a significant oversight due to colonial slavery being a highly mega super substantial moment in African American history. This isn't to say that he doesn't discuss the impact of slavery in his piece, as although it's not explicitly mentioned, it is a highly prevalent theme throughout his work. However, Baldwin does not take time to discuss the history of colonialism in the United States and how it has ongoing effects for Native and African Americans. Not including colonization in your critical race theory nowadays is like not including the importance of Ugg boots and Taylor Swift to the history of white people. It's a pretty big deal, and most people would feel like to say that it didn't have some sort of impact on them. This means that his work will only be able to examine the systems working against people of colour to a moderate level, rather than being able to deeply critique it. Watson demonstrates a similar problem, as her introduction does not examine the experiences and inputs of non-white migrants. Although her work spends a significant amount of time investigating and dismantling the relationship between Indigenous people and colonialists, the work fails to mention the role of non-white migrants, a theme that is solely focused on in Baldwin's work. A discussion regarding the contributions of non-white migrants to the continuance and empowerment of colonization would have demonstrated a more rounded argument. She notes that colonial practices continue in Australian society today, authorised by the government and implemented through the people. Australia is now recognised as one of the most multicultural societies in the world, and if her argument does not address the influence non-white migrants have on the oppression of Indigenous peoples, then a significant group of people is ignored, and some holes begin to form in her argument. Finally, there exists extreme dissonance between the writers on a major point in each of their works: recognition. Throughout his piece, Baldwin calls upon white people to recognise the position they have in society and recognise that their ignorance towards the plight of African Americans can continue due to their willful blindness. Much of his work also focuses on white people needing to recognise African Americans as equal. Although Watson would be sympathetic to his argument, it's likely she would have a significant issue with Baldwin seeking recognition from white Americans. Watson outlines how recognition is used in colonial systems to strengthen power and control over First Nations peoples through dictating the ways in which this recognition is legitimised. She notes that often this recognition ends with a pragmatic and empty gesture. She argues that through this system, Indigenous people remain possessions of the state and would therefore likely warn Baldwin against seeking this recognition. However, this is not a theme that Baldwin could address without recognising the influences of colonisation on the oppression of African Americans. Although there are significant differences in their arguments, when read together, Baldwin and Watson's piece form a well-rounded, self-critiquing piece of critical race theory. And although many decades have passed since Baldwin's text was written, his work remains as prevalent and important as Watson's 21st century piece. The treatment of people of colour around the world, especially in Australia and the US, has not bettered significantly. Although some may argue that the violence is no longer as explicit or rampant, the systematic oppression remains as potent as ever. Unfortunately, Baldwin's argument that systematic oppression will continue to exist unless white people get woke has become more of a realised prediction. In the United States, the prevalence of the matter has not decreased. Although the civil rights movement is not a forward runner in the 21st century, a movement called Black Lives Matter, or BLM, has emerged to take up the voice of some of the African American community. BLM states their goal is an ideological and political intervention in a world where black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. The death rates of African Americans continue to rise, and there is an endless list of young men and women who've been unlawfully killed by police in situations that have undeniably been driven by racial profiling. It is clear that there remains systemic targeting of African Americans, as many white people can still not face the challenge posed to them by Baldwin, to look critically at their own personal contribution to the oppression of people of colour in their own country. Now to Australia, where the recently re-elected Prime Minister, ScoMo, a man whose nickname sounds like the epitome of a shit time at Engadine, has declared that there might be a referendum to include the recognition of Indigenous Australians as First Nation peoples in the Constitution in the next federal election. Although this pleased many people in the wider community, Watson would likely not appreciate the government's gesture. Many Aboriginal critical theorists are cynical towards the idea of constitutional recognition due to the underlining theme that it is the First Nations people being included, recognised and controlled by a colonial system again. Many question the relevance or importance to the Aboriginal community of having the recognition enshrined in the Constitution, a document that is a physical representation of Australia's colonial history. The notion of recognition in the Constitution demonstrates that the government is not ready to recognise their own role in creating disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. This idea that Indigenous people can or cannot be included in the Australian identity is one way that the government controls Indigenous peoples and maintains its power over Indigenous identity. However, it's not like this kind of policy is new in Australia. The contemporary political problem of race disparity is globally felt, but especially so by people of colour in Australia and the United States, which is why Baldwin's argument remains ever relevant in a conservative US, and Watson's argument continues to question the oppressive norms of Australian policy. Both Baldwin and Watson call for there to be a kind of introspection from white people around these systems. Why is recognition seemingly more important to colonisers than the colonised? How and why are people of colour more likely to be incarcerated and killed? How are we individually a part of this system? In Watson's case, she would likely warn white people to be careful not to stray into the zone of the white saviour and fix the Indigenous problem, as much Australian policy would support. But allowing the critique of the systems white people take for granted is one of the first steps in the long journey to ending systematic oppression. It's also one of the most difficult. As Baldwin notes, to act to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. So what can we do? Well, as a political actor, Baldwin and Watson challenge me to constantly review my place in my community and my country, and how I benefit from the ignorance that our society needs to not break down. Although this requires some systematic change, it starts with an individual realisation that white people need to stop wanting to be ignorant and take a deep look at the ugly side of our history, especially Australians. To be aware of and critique colonial systems, to educate and challenge those around us of their positions in society, and support and listen to Indigenous voices is the smallest of steps we can take that could actually lead to a larger societal change. For further information, I'd recommend you look at these websites. So be on your way, get woke white people. That's our show for this evening. Thank you and good night.